Hello and welcome to Nikolay's genetics lessons, and today's problem is a large population of laboratory animals has been allowed to breed randomly for a number of generations. After several generations, 25% of the animals display a recessive trait, the same percentage as at the beginning of the breeding program. The rest of the animals show the dominant phenotype with heterozygotes indistinguishable from the homozygous dominants. What is the most reasonable conclusion that can be drawn from the fact that the frequency of the recessive trait has not changed over time? And here's a variants to choose from. I want you to take a look at this picture, which shows us the frequency of the alleles. P stands for the dominant allele, Q stands for the recessive allele. If we have only two alleles in a population, of course these two alleles would make 100%. If frequency of one allele is 10%, that means that frequency of the other allele 90%. If frequency of one allele 20%, that means that frequency of the other allele is 80%. And these three lines represent the frequency of the genotypes. For example, blue color here shows frequency of the homozygous recessive, in red color frequency of the homozygous dominant, and in green color we see frequency of the heterozygous genotype. According to our problem, frequency of the homozygous recessive genotype was 25%. That means that frequency of the recessive and dominant allele was 50% each. And we can draw a line here. And as you see, frequency of the dominant allele would be 50% and frequency of the recessive allele would be 50%. And frequency of the genotypes would be as follows. Homozygous dominant genotype is going to be 25%. Homozygous recessive genotype is also going to be 25%. And frequency of the heterozygous genotype is going to be 50%. And if, for example, if frequency of the dominant and recessive allele would be different, then the frequency of the three genotypes also going to be different. Here is going to be a frequency of the dominant genotype, here is going to be a frequency of the heterozygous genotype, and here is going to be a frequency of the homozygous recessive genotype. Mathematically, we also can say that frequency of the three genotypes that can be made by two alleles is going to be, so F stands for the frequency of the three genotypes, P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared, and all the three genotypes frequencies would equal to 1 or 100%. P squared in this formula stands for the homozygous dominant genotype, 2PQ stands for the frequency of the heterozygous genotype, so capital A and small a, and frequency of the recessive genotype would be Q squared or small a genotype. I'm using the same colors as colors of these three lines that represent different genotypes. But you also have to understand that these two genotypes make one phenotype, and this genotype here makes another phenotype. So three genotypes and two phenotypes in simple Mendelian genetics. We also can say not just homozygous dominant genotype, but capital A times capital A. And capital A here represent a frequency. If we have a frequency of the dominant allele 0.5, so that means that 0.5 squared. So if we square 0.5, we are going to get 0.25 or 25%. And as for the heterozygous genotype, we are going to get again capital A times small a, and frequency of the dominant allele we know is 0.5, so 2 times 0.5 and times frequency of the recessive allele, which is also 0.5. So we are going to get 0.5 total frequency of the heterozygous genotype or 50%. And as for the recessive genotype, we also can say frequency of one recessive allele times frequency of the other allele. So it's going to be 0.5 5 squared, or 0.25, or 25%. And according to Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, these frequencies are going to be stable from one generation to another one if there are not going to be any forces that are going to change allelic frequencies. For example, it can be mutation or migration, or assortative matings, or if some genotype or phenotype would have better fitness than the rest. Then in this case we are going to have from one generation to another one change in allelic frequency, and that means also change in phenotypic frequencies. According to our problem, frequency of the homozygous recessive genotype doesn't change from one generation to another generation. Let's check our variance of the answers. That means that genotype which is homozygous dominant is lethal. In this case, we are going to have change in frequency of the alleles, change in frequency of the genotypes, and dominant allele from one generation to another one. Frequency of the dominant allele would be reduced and frequency of the recessive allele would increase, and that means that frequency of the homozygous recessive genotype also going to increase. But we see that it doesn't change, so this is wrong statement. And statement B, there has been sexual selection favoring recessive allele A. Again, this is also wrong statement, because in this case frequency of the recessive genotype would increase and frequency of the homozygous dominant genotype would decrease. And statement C, there has been a higher rate of mutation of the allele which is dominant to allele which is recessive. Actually not. Again, all such changes would cause not only change in allelic frequencies, but also change in genotypic frequencies. So this is also wrong statement, and we have only one variant left. Variant D, the two phenotypes are about equally adaptive under laboratory conditions, and this is exact reason why frequency of the homozygous recessive genotype didn't change, because frequency of the alleles didn't change. So our choice is variant D. And this is all for today. Subscribe and see you in the next video. Goodbye.